This is a 1981 Yanmar YM2610D. It is basically the same as a John Deere 850, and you would think that the D stands for diesel. However, that D means that it is four-wheel drive. The biggest difference between the John Deere and the Yanmar, this has a shuttle shift transmission with a possible 15 forward gears and 5 in reverse, as opposed to the straight manual transmission that the John Deere had. Another difference, the water outlet has no thermostat, which is very strange. This engine runs quite a bit cooler. It makes 29 horsepower on its 3 cylinders, and it passes 26 horsepower out to our PTO in the rear. Now, I bought this as a running and driving tractor, and it's actually in really good shape for its age. I was told there are only 2 known issues. The tachometer doesn't work, and it is hard to start. He said it takes a pretty long time to crank when it's hot, and it takes a really long time to crank when it's cold, but it always starts. Let's see what else we find.
Now, if you've been following along with this channel for any amount of time, you'll already know what my first step is, and that is to drain all of the lubricating fluids and send those old fluids out for analysis at Blackstone Labs. This will give me the opportunity to see how well the engine and transmission are wearing internally without having to take anything apart. It also gives me a little bit of a look into the past. I can see how the previous owner maintained it by seeing what fluid they used and how long that fluid has been in there. I was able to track down a repair manual for this tractor on eBay, and that showed me that on the back here we have a screen that is for our trans-hydraulic fluid, so I'm removing that so I can get that cleaned out. Luckily, it wasn't in too bad of shape. It still had adequate flow all the way around. The manual recommended using diesel fuel to clean this out, so that's what I'm using here, diesel fuel and a little nylon brush, and just kind of softly getting all this years of accumulated gunk off of it. Once this was cleaned, I reinstalled it back on the tractor and added fresh oil and trans-hydraulic fluid. The next step here is just getting acquainted with the tractor. Because this is new to me, I don't know any of its little quirks, so I decided to hop out into the backyard where I'm in the process of extending our chicken coop run and drill a few holes. After operating this tractor for a couple of hours, I did notice that the overflow was starting to, well, overflow. And it's not actually supposed to overflow, despite its name. It's supposed to absorb the overflow from the radiator and then maintain it in a little reservoir. That reservoir was overflowing, and that usually indicates a head gasket leak, so I decided to pull it into the shop and investigate a little bit further. So you see these little bubbles that are going from the radiator to the overflow. That is indicative of a head gasket leak. It looks like the combustion gases are sneaking their way from the cylinder into the radiator and then into the overflow. And wouldn't you know it, this was the exact same day that I got my oil sample analysis back from Blackstone, which confirmed we did have coolant inside the oil, indicating again head gasket leak. So rather than tackle the head gasket right away, I decided to see if I could fix the hard starting issue first, because I didn't want to have this engine all the way torn down, have the head machined, put it all back together, and then still have a hard start issue that I've got to figure out. If I can solve that now, then I can add that to the list of everything that needs to get done, and I can do everything at once. After I removed the injectors, I did crank the engine over, and sure enough, I got a ton of coolant that was squirting out of the number 1 injector, again verifying we've got a head gasket issue. Now, rebuilding the injectors was actually pretty fun. All I had to do was take them apart. They're poppet-style injectors, obviously no electronics on these. They're all mechanical, so they're very fun to deal with. Once I got them all taken apart, I then sent them through my ultrasonic cleaner. On the left, I've got 3 little jars that have seafoam in them. That's for all the internal parts. And then on the right, I've got the outer housings. That way I can just throw a dishwashing pod in there for detergent. The reason that I don't throw all of the pieces in there is that I don't want the heavy detergent on the internal parts. I've had better luck with seafoam removing built-up carbon rather than just straight detergents. And once they're all clean, I simply put them back together. I'm using some fresh seafoam treatment to lubricate all of the internal parts as they go together, and then a little bit of Teflon tape for the NPT fitting. And once we get these injectors installed, obviously we're going to fire up this tractor, and I'm going to let that video run for a little bit longer than I normally would, because I want you guys to see just how poorly this thing started. You'll see it crank for a long time now. Naturally, it's going to crank longer anytime you replace the injectors, because you're going to have plenty of air in the line, but that wasn't our issue here. This thing was a very hard start anyways. So we'll let the video play out a little bit. You guys will see the whole tuning process. Basically, I'm just going to crack open each individual line while it's running to let all of the air out. You would never do this on a modern diesel that runs on a much higher pressure, but again, this is a very old tractor running relatively low diesel pressure, and that is the proper adjustment for how to get the air out of the lines. All right, so here goes the first start. Like I said, this is going to take a little bit longer just because there's air in the lines, but it shouldn't take this long. This is clearly still a hard start issue. Spoiler alert, I end up finding the problem later. It is a cracked head leading to the valves not being able to seat. Now that the engine is running nice and smooth, the next step is to pour in our Blue Devil head gasket treatment. And normally you have to remove a thermostat before this step, but if you remember, this engine does not have a thermostat. So I pour it into the radiator, it makes its way into the cooling system, where eventually it goes through that leaking head gasket into the combustion chamber, where it's met with high temperature and pressure and somehow makes a temporary seal. Now, of course, this is a chemical solution to a mechanical problem, so this is very temporary, but I have taken apart engines after using this treatment, and there's never been any damage inside. As far as I can tell, this is some type of a silicon solution that, when it's met with that high temperature and pressure, creates what almost looks like a very thin glass seal wherever your head gasket is leaking. And once it's all poured in, the process is very simple. You just let it idle for 30 minutes, and then you can put your radiator cap back on and then drive it and operate it as normal. So after the injector cleaning and the Blue Devil treatment, the next step was to put more hours on the machine. That tells us if our injectors have helped it run a little bit better, helped it start a little bit better. It tells us if the head gasket was small enough that the Blue Devil was able to fully seal it. It also lets us see if there's any other issues, maybe with the transmission or the hydraulic system. And so that's exactly what I did. I spent about 8 hours on the machine moving earth over the next couple of days, and it was running great. It still had a hard start issue. The head gasket was holding no problem until it wasn't. After about 8 hours of use, I did start to get some small air bubbles back into the system. So that's telling me, of course, what we already knew, that the head gasket is not something that is small and can easily be fixed. We're going to have to take this thing all the way down and fix it. And luckily, after those 8 hours, I couldn't find anything else wrong with it. So our current list is pull it back into the shop. We'll do the head gasket. Anything we see along the way that looks bad, we'll go ahead and replace. We'll fix our tachometer, and we should be good to go. Now this little doohickey that I'm removing here, this is called a thermostart. And this little device takes a reservoir of diesel fuel and actually puts it onto a heating element that, when you apply 12 volts, will heat up that diesel fuel to make the intake hot so that it will help with starting in cold weather. This seemed to be in good working order, but the reservoir was a little bit old, so I decided to replace that along the way. Next up is our intake manifold, but before I can get that all the way off, I do have to pull off our injector lines. Next up is our valve cover. Next up is moving the alternator out of the way. Then we've got our upper radiator hose. Now we've got our coolant reservoir. Then we've got our fan shroud, and then the radiator, which then gives us access to our fan bolts. Now we've got our water pump. This is our housing between the water pump and our cylinder head, and this is one of the few components that is different between the Yanmar and the John Deere version. Next up is our muffler, followed by our exhaust manifold. Now luckily, this is just a simple overhead valve design with traditional push rods, so we don't have to worry about the timing at all to get this head off. This is our diesel fuel return line. Now we've got the injectors out of there. Now I can pull off our valve train. Now we've got the fun part, our head bolts. And finally, our head.
All right, not so great news on our engine here. You can see, on top of having a whole bunch of pitting, this looks like it had what I'll call a farmer rebuild at some point. It looks like they put new sleeves in. When they did, they clearly did not deck it. The height on our sleeves is much higher. It also looks like they hit this thing pretty hard with a wire wheel or maybe a sander. It's actually amazing that any of the coolant lines actually held. It looks like the gasket would probably be sitting right up here on this ridge, and then it's really low here. So I would expect these coolant lines to be leaking right out the side or into our oil passages. That didn't seem to be happening. What this thing needs, it needs a complete and total teardown. We've got to put new cylinders in, and then we have to have this thing redecked. Unfortunately, that is not possible right now. I need this thing up and running as fast as humanly possible. I figure I have about 100 hours that I need out of this machine before it can finally sit in my shop for 6 to 8 months, where I do a complete and total teardown of it and build it back up as a perfectly new old tractor. So what we are going to do is, it's not even like a poor man's rebuild. This is like a poor man's sketchy cousin rebuild. Let me show you what the plan is. So you see our number one piston is just about at top dead center. I'll go ahead and turn this crank over until all three of these pistons are on their way up or down and they're just below that deck surface. I'll then use this duct seal, which is like kind of like a squishy little putty, that I'll go ahead and put in the cylinders around the outside. And what that will do is that will keep any of the little metal particles that I'm going to sand off of the top from falling in and getting around our piston ring. I also need to seal these 3 oil passages. Once these are all sealed up, again, when we're sanding the top here, hopefully nothing will make its way down into the oil. I will then take the flattest piece of steel I've got with adhesive sandpaper on it. We'll flip it down on top of this. We'll give it a sand job this way. We'll give it a sand job that way. And then we will see if we can get these high spots down just a little bit and try and get as close to a clean mating surface as possible. I'll then pull all the putty off. We'll then pull whatever I'm stuffing in here to keep the sand grit and little pieces of metal out of there. Clean it up as best as we can, put on a new head gasket, put on the shaved down head, and hope for the best.
Before I start my poor man's repair on the engine block, I wanted to get this head over to the machine shop, so I start by removing all of the studs to try to make their life a little bit easier. Unfortunately, once I got this head over there, we did find that there were multiple cracks in it. There had been some repairs done to it in the past that weren't of the highest quality, and 4 out of the 6 valves were leaking. So this head ended up being non-repairable and unfortunately ended up in a junkyard. The good news is that because this engine was found in multiple John Deere tractors, it was relatively easy to find parts for, albeit expensive. So it cost, I think, $1,299 before taxes for the new head, but at least we're going to have a new head on this tractor when it's all said and done. So I learned this trick from my buddy who's from Alabama, and he used a piece of glass because it was the flattest thing that he had around his shop. I've got a 3/8 inch thick piece of steel that I measured at about 3/1000 of an inch off from being perfectly flat, and if I can get the deck to be that flat, I will be in great shape. Now you can see immediately it is taking off a ton from these cylinder sleeves. They were all about 20 to 30 thousandths of an inch over the deck, so it took a lot of time. I think I was using 80 grit to start off with just to get those sleeves worn down. I then switched to 120, and then I did a final pass at 150, and you can see here everything's coming out nice and smooth. Again, this is not a long-term repair. This is just to get about 100 hours out of the machine, and the reason that I feel comfortable with this is because I'm not going to be doing any long-term damage to any of the internal components that I will eventually reuse when I do the rebuild in the future. Once I was done with the engine deck, I then moved on to all of the other components that I wanted to make nice and flat, including the exhaust manifold on both sides, the muffler, the intake manifold, the valve covers, all that stuff. It worked out perfectly. All of the surfaces ended up being perfectly clean and ready to install. Next up is prepping the new cylinder head for install, so all I'm doing is reinstalling all of the components that I removed from the old one. Now luckily I'm getting some expert help on this engine buildup from my favorite mechanic. You guys might remember her from our last engine build, which was the Chevy 454 big block that went into a medium duty pizza truck that is now living out in Chicago. That engine is still happy and healthy, and this one is quite a bit simpler. Her favorite part is torquing down the cylinder heads, and then she loves using the engine assembly lube when putting in the push rods and the valve train. Now I'm going to let the time lapse on this engine buildup play out a little bit slower than I normally do, because occasionally I'll go back and watch these videos, and I know in 5 or 10 years I'm going to be watching how tiny she is working on this engine, and I'm just going to miss every second of it. So if you want to skip ahead, skip ahead. Otherwise, enjoy this engine buildup. All right, we're almost done with this engine buildup, and there's a couple of things that I wanted to point out. I did end up changing the overflow from the plastic style to the aluminum. I've had a few of those plastic ones break, and I like these aluminum ones a little bit better. And then if you guys remember, our tachometer was not working. That is because a cable runs from the gauge underneath our water pump into a little housing where it then has a gear that spins with our camshaft. So the faster the camshaft spins, the faster the internal gear spins, similar to an old style tachometer. That cable was broken, so I was able to source a replacement for that. The last thing I have to do is fill it up with water and then pressure test the cooling system, and we should be good to go. Once I got the engine up to operating temperature, I hopped out into the yard and just started putting some hours on this machine, and luckily there is no shortage of work. Over the next couple of months, I put it through maybe 50 or 60 hot and cold cycles, and I'm happy to report there are no issues with it. We don't have any cross-contamination of fluids, we don't have any coolant consumption, everything is working as intended. So the next step is to continue to use this tractor as a tractor all the way through winter and spring and get a majority of the yard work done around the house until I'm in a position that I don't need to use it for 6 months or so. At that point, we'll do a proper rebuild with new sleeves, new pistons. We'll clean up our engine block, give it a nice little paint job. We'll tear the whole tractor down. We'll replace a lot of the stuff that isn't an issue now, like seals, but will be an issue in the future. And then we'll give this thing a nice paint job, basically a proper restoration similar to the forklift if you guys saw that. And then I should have a nice little machine for hopefully the rest of my life. But before I leave you wonderful people, I want to show you what it is like cold starting this rig now, because you guys saw how hard it was to start after that injector rebuild earlier. So here you go. So that's it. Thanks for watching, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thanks for watching, everybody. Bye-bye.